Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Dalibor Rohac and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friends
Giselle Donnelly, I'm also at AEI, and
Yulia Zhozha with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities.
On our podcast, we talk about the challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Kira Rudik, the leader of the Holost Party and member of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Kira, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show, and I suppose we can start by asking about your impressions from last week's NATO summit in Washington, which featured Ukraine really as its core component, both in terms of trying to chart the way ahead for the alliance's support for Ukraine, and also in terms of thinking about Ukraine's future place within the alliance, where a certain commitment was made towards the irreversibility of Ukraine's path to NATO. Are you, on the whole, satisfied with what has come out of the summit, or have Ukrainian expectations been not fully met?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and privilege to be on this podcast. So, Dalibor, to answer your question, there are actually two sides. The first side is I'm speaking as a politician, as a representative of Ukrainian people. And the second side is speaking as a Ukrainian who is constantly living under those horrendous attacks. As a Ukrainian who doesn't have a guarantee that when I go to bed every evening that I will wake up in the morning. As a Ukrainian who is often talking to my friends who are fighting at the front, who went there as volunteers and who are asking very simple questions like when the weapons arrive and what's going to happen with the support next year. So in general, we are happy that we are moving forward with our NATO integration, and we are hearing many supportive words. And irreversibility is a nice direction, right? But I think what we are looking for is a switch in the perception and strategy of our allies from helping us fight to letting us win the war. And I think we would feel this change in the perception and change in strategy if we see more courageous decisions being made with regards of getting us enough of the air defense systems to protect places such as Children's Hospital that were attacked, or to get enough of the air defense systems so the remains of our energy system would be protected as well, including our nuclear stations that could be targets as well. We would see that there is a change in this strategy when there would be no doubt that we can use the international weapons, the NATO-grade weapons that were provided to us to attack Russians on their territory and destroy their military base. Basically make sure that it would be harder, almost impossible for them to kill us in our sleep. And we do not see this change in the strategy because we do not see that in the decisions. And it's a pity because we are looking at a situation where it is not only Russia that is watching the reaction of the West. There are so many authoritarian regimes all over the world who are watching precisely as well. And I think they are not getting a strong answer to the question what would happen if they would start full-scale invasion from their side.
Can I ask a follow-up question on this? I think you find deep agreement among certainly the host, but also much of our audience. It seemed to me, and you were referring to it, it seemed to me that the bombing of the hospital, that wasn't just a hospital, that took a lot of coordination on the Russian side, indeed in conditions where Ukraine does still not have sufficient air defense systems, seemed almost like a message sent from Russia primarily to Ukraine, but also to the rest of the world, trying to portray NATO on the eve of its 75th summit like an organization or an alliance that is insufficient, that cannot provide, indeed, for sufficient security, that cannot help end this war. To what extent do you see, in previous summits before the full-scale invasion, Russia, whether we wanted it or not, featured prominently at NATO summits. Now it does not do that anymore in terms of the physical presence, but it seems to want to continue to play a role, including through these attacks. What's your take on this? How do you see, from a Ukrainian perspective, Russian positioning, Russian aggression in the context of NATO when Russia, if that makes sense, still insists on a position in which Ukraine will never be offered membership?
To answer this, I need to explain to our audience the meaning of this children's hospital. So it's not just children's hospital. However, it is terrible that we have to say it's not just children's hospital because we value every human's life. But this is the main children's hospital in Ukraine, the largest one. And this is the place where the most complicated cases are being solved, that the best doctors are working and treating. And this is like a last resort or the best hope for so many parents in Ukraine. It is, the name of this hospital is very symbolic. And in doctors' community, it's also symbolic because this is the place where the most innovations are conducted and used. And so many children throughout Ukraine have found like a real cure. So when the attack happened, thousands of volunteers arrived to the hospital to help clean up the rubble, to bring the water. It was a huge traffic jam, and I think it was unimaginable how people got closer together to help the ones in need, to bring water to kids, to bring food and even some toys. And to imagine what happened, you need to imagine kids with no hair on their heads because of the chemo, who are sitting in the heat and waiting until the rubbles are taken out so the medical officers can take them into another hospital. And I remember being there with some of the volunteers, and one of them asked, "Do you think it was a message?" And this is so unfortunate that I have to answer, I think yes. Because we see that Russia, in their attacks, they're very attached to particular dates. Like, for example, they attack us on Christmas, on New Year's, on the previous day of victory in May, then it's a day of Ukrainian army or day of Ukrainian unity. And so this date of the NATO summit reminded us of how attached to those dates they are. You see, in Russia's propaganda's mind, they are already fighting NATO. And by inability to protect the ones whom we should be able to protect like the most, right? They are showing weakness of the NATO, and they are showing it not only to their people using the propaganda, not only to Ukraine, but they are showing it to the whole world. Again, including the authoritarian regimes that they need to prove the weakness of the West. So don't get me wrong. We are very grateful for all the help and support that we are receiving. We know that there are two reasons why we are able just to survive to the point where we are. The first reason is the brave men and women of Ukraine who are fighting at the front. But the second reason is the brave men and women of the democratic world who are standing with us by different means. But they do, and they do in the European Union, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Canada. And we see that and we know that. And as a politician, I know that because every time I do my visit, I speak to people on the streets, to people on TV shows, and speak to politicians, and I can get this feeling. So it is still there. The support is still there, and we know that it continues to help us. But what we are trying to deliver as a message is that there would not be this turning of the tide unless there would be a change in the decisions. Change in the decisions, making sure that we will get not like a small amount of weapons, not small amount of supplies, but to getting enough of what our military are asking. You see how efficient and effective they are with the weapons and ammunition in the amounts that we receive them. So imagine what would have happened if we have gotten everything that we needed at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, but we cannot turn back the time. So then right now, sooner rather than later. And our president was very clear, saying like, for every day of the delay, we are paying by the lives of our people. And this is absolutely true. And we know that and we see that. And we are all grieving right now with the families of the people that we have lost during this attack. But the question is like, when the next attack, and would we have enough of the supplies? I can give you good examples. You know, it's scary to be in the bomb shelter. It's much worse to be in the bomb shelter when there is no electricity. It's very cold in winter and kids do not have their devices charged. But it's much, much, much worse when you're sitting in a bomb shelter knowing that probably your air defense systems do not have enough of the weapons to take the missiles down, and that they have to make those decisions on like, do we fire right now or do we not? And this is really scary.
The Russian message in attacks like the Children's Hospital, the cruelty is the point almost. The Russians are saying, we will do whatever it takes, no matter how horrific it is, to achieve our goals in Ukraine. And you have to say, if this past week's summit was any measurement of that, that this is a very effective piece of propaganda, and it intimidates Western leaders who prefer to look away and to talk about things like, percentage of GDP for defense spending and, ephemera, rather than stare the Russian message in the face and respond to it appropriately. I mean, to what degree do you think that Russians are intentionally being as savage as they can be as itself a tool of not just propaganda, but of warfare?
You see, I think it's both. So it's, again, not only the propaganda, it's also a huge wish to destroy us as a state, as a nation. And we have seen that in Bucha, in Irpin, in so many other places. But on the other hand, what we have seen is that the change that happened in the positions of the Western leaders is tremendous as well. If we go back in 2.5 years, we have heard no to every ask that we had, starting from wide-range weapons, tanks, Patriot missile systems, fighter jets, everything. And we learned how to work with this no's, that it's just, no is just the first answer. But what we need to highlight is that also they are trying to work with people here, with the very strong narrative that has been here since, 2014. And this narrative is, they do not want you there. You will be always citizens of the third, second class, whatever. And this was what Russian propaganda was trying to feed Ukrainian people for a while. And every time when there is not a strong response, but a really big response to their actions, they continue doing so. And they continue sharing this propaganda saying, well, look, Georgia, look, Moldova, this is what is happening to the ones who dared to leave our orbit. They do not want you there in EU. They do not want you there in NATO. It's safer to be with Mother Russia and our Slavic brothers and sisters. I'm repeating it almost literally. And I think same way as, what I remembered is that death of Alexei Navalny was exactly at the beginning of the Munich conference, where everybody was supposed to gather to talk about how to fight Russia back. And Russia was telling them, well, you better think twice because right now you're not very effective in what you're doing. We still can hit democracy really hard. And same way that we are absolutely sure that this attack, it was timely and it required to have the victims to show the West that they are unable to hit Russia where it hurts. And this is why we need to contradict that, and we need to work harder to show stronger response, and again to highlight where the strongest response can be. And again, as a politician and not a Ukrainian, I understand how hard it may be to start producing weapons as fast as they needed to deliver them to Ukraine. But there are other ways. There are sanctions that need to work better. And it's on the democratic world to make sure that the loopholes are closed. Not in the package number 23, but in the packages that are closed. And for example, the advocacy project that we have been working for 2.5 years is using Russian money that are being frozen in the democratic countries for the sake of Ukraine. By the way, that is a very interesting point. When the Congress voted for the package to support Ukraine after almost 8 months of the delay, and it was a really joyful day here in Ukraine, and we were very happy. And the Repo Act, that is an act that allows to use frozen Russian assets for the sake of Ukraine in the United States. It was voted at the same package, at the same day. And if you look at what Russian propagandists were talking about it, what were they annoyed about? They did not care about additional weapons that we would receive. They did not care that there will be more weapons in Ukraine to kill their soldiers or to defend ourselves against them. What they cared about was this, how they say it, atrocious act of not working rule of law. And they show that the money means a lot to them. And this is where we need to hit them where it hurts. And this is why we really need to move forward, not only to the point where we are right now, and I think we have gone very far, making sure that the prospects and proceeds of the frozen Russian assets in Europe will be given to us as a loan, but actually get to the point where almost $500 billion of Russian money can be confiscated and used for the sake of Ukraine. That will show Russia that West means business, but it will also show other authoritarian regimes what would happen if they would dare to start a full-scale invasion. And I think it will be a very strong message. It requires courage. It requires a political courage, we understand that, but this is the change that we need from our democratic allies.
It's such an important point because when you look at the sort of collective economic weight of Ukraine's Western allies and you compare it to the sort of size of Russia's economy, even if you include the ties that Russia now has to the Chinese and North Korean industrial base, there is no reason in the world why this should be such a hard task for, the European Union, United States, UK, other countries to, outspend Russia in this war effort. All it requires is really sort of determination to just stay the course and treat it as an urgency. And going back to this question of Russian war crimes as a tactic, let me ask you this. It is quite odd to me that sometimes when Russians do something like this, it helps stiffen the spines of Western leaders. People went to Bucha, even sort of relatively dovish figures in European politics, saw what happened in Bucha, and I think they all walked away shaken and determined to help Ukraine, people like Borrell and others. Yet at other times, you have this children's hospital being bombed day before the NATO summit, and if anything, I think it sort of amplified the voices of all those, peaceniks and, Orban and Orban adjacent people who want to strike a deal, the war criminal in the Kremlin. How can we make sure that these acts, these atrocities have the stiffening of the spines effect on Western leaders as opposed to the demoralizing effect that seems to be setting more and more as race in the US presidential election seems to be between two very old people who are hardly committed to America's global leadership, and as sort of number of interlocutors in the West that you can really count on seems to be dwindling somewhat. Give us ammunition to make our arguments in a more compelling way, please.
The first and foremost and the main question one should be asking to anyone who is talking about striking the deal with Russians is who or what in the whole world is able to make sure that Putin will keep his part of the bargain. I do not think right now there is a line of political leaders alongside UN saying, take me, I will vouch for Putin. And before this deal is done and before we have this assurance, there can be no discussion about any kind of peace deal. I want to tell you a personal story. I was born right before Soviet Union collapsed. And in my career and in my story, I have been going through everything that my country was going, right? So when Soviet Union collapsed, there was no jobs. My mom had to leave for the United States to find a job. And then there was a poverty of the 90s, then there were 2000s, then there was a revolution and war that started in 2014 and not in 2022. And I became a politician with a very naive and very simple goal. I wanted for us to build a country where we would have a next generations of Ukrainians that would not be so tied by what's happening in the country and will be more free in pursuing their dreams. And now we are robbed of that because our next generation have seen dead bodies. They know how to study in the bomb shelters. They know how to act when the air raid siren is on. They had to flee their homes and ask their parents an impossible question. Mommy, are we refugees now? So there is one thing, that we owe to those kids. They should not have to fight this war again, over and over. And this is exactly what will happen if we wouldn't stop it right now. And there is no way in stopping it with signing some international protocols. There is no way in finishing it in making sure that Putin says and everybody believes that. I suppose that it's not even a way of changing president in Russia, because Russia as an empire would always want to destroy us, and not only us, but the majority of their neighbors. They are trying to rebuild Soviet Union or Russian Empire, and Putin is very clear about that. So before the democratic world figures out what are the ways, maybe there are some imaginary ways of how do you work with dictatorships aside of fighting them. We continue fighting. And by this point in Ukraine, I have never heard anyone speaking about giving up. And I have spoken to people closer to the front, fighting at the front, and people cleaning the rubble near the children's hospital, people working with the refugees from all over Ukraine. It is true that right now the world becoming more and more numb to what is happening. And this is why one of the ways is, of course, to bring politicians here and to make them witness what is happening right now, both with the torture rooms that we uncovered in all the deoccupied territories and with what happened in Bucha and with everything that is happening every single day. And when people are coming, I'm usually bringing them to my home, because on January 2nd, there was a missile hit where the home where I live, and it happened 400 meters away, so far away. But the blast of the hit was so strong that I have witnessed my windows being pulled off their frames and thrown into the middle of the rooms. I had glass in like every way in my body, and it felt like my personal Armageddon. We were able to rebuild, and I was so lucky that I had only minor injuries. But the home where the missile hit, it's a 9-story, 6 entrances building, and it burned almost to the shell. 5 people lost their lives, and 200 families have lost their homes. And when I'm driving people around, they see that there is nothing military around here. Nothing. So these attacks continue. And finishing to answer your question, Dalibor, I think we are speaking too much about what will happen when Ukraine wins. And it's important to give people hope, because the hope is the major fuel that we are running on. I think we are not speaking enough about what will happen if we lose, how it would change not only Ukraine or Europe or European Union, how it would change the world as it is in making a clear statement that one country can annex the territory of another one, can commit all kinds of the war crimes from the war crimes list and get away with it. And if that's the precedent that is okay to happen in the modern world, then let's ask ourselves a question how the future would look like. And I think for everyone who is not only thinking about the future of his own country, of his own community, but of the democracy and the democratic world and the unity as well, understands that. And final thing about NATO that I forgot to mention, but I think it's very important. But every time we are talking about NATO, we need to remind ourselves where it came from. It was an alliance that was created to defend the democratic world against the Soviet Union. Guess what? This is the job that we are currently doing. And I think it's only fair and logical and just to give us enough of the weapons to do this job right.
We absolutely agree. And thank you for talking us through this in such personal and difficult terms. I want to ask you another difficult question. We keep talking about, and you do too, about the effectiveness of Russian propaganda that we know is tailored to different audiences, but we also know it is having its effect, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but all the way here in Washington, D.C. And of course, that brings me full circle back to Ukraine. This morning, we've seen opinion poll from Ukraine being published in Kyiv Independent, suggesting that while last year in May, about 23% of Ukrainians were in favor of peace negotiations, now the number almost doubled to 44%. While the absolute majority of these people do agree that it cannot be on Russian terms. That creates more of a difficult position because in everybody's rational understanding, it's not just that Russia has violated all the agreements that it has signed over many, many years, and not just in connection to weaker, smaller countries like Ukraine, but also treaties with the United States. Beyond that, it's also that Russia reiterates and Putin reiterates that the position that it has in these possible negotiations is absolutely incompatible because you cannot negotiate with someone who wants to wipe your country from the earth. So help us understand how you as a politician go about this and understand these numbers. How much is this due to Russian propaganda? How much is this frankly due to Western hesitation and not being convinced enough to give in the end F-16s and Patriots, etc. But it's always too little, too late, and that of course has an effect on the morale of people, both and primarily the ones fighting on the front lines, but also the rest of Ukrainians. So help us make sense of that.
Sure. So it was very clear in this poll that they were unable to get the information from people fighting at the front. So this is, they say, like, for people who are living in the areas where it was possible to do the poll. And it is very important for us that today when we have seen the poll, the first thing in our political chat between the MPs was, we are so proud that we can still do those polls, right? It means that we are democracy.
They're not taking polls in Russia, are they?
But it's very important, like to see the truth, look at the truth in the eyes and understand what's happening. So the first take is, of course, people are exhausted. We need to understand it. It's very hard, and to fight for 2.5 years of the full-scale invasion and for 11 years since Russia first attacked us, it is hard and it's taking its toll on people. And I think close closer to the winter, it will be even tougher. Because I can tell you, your morale can be broken much easier when you have electricity for 4 hours a day. And it's right now, it's the hottest days of the summer. People cannot do their jobs. People are totally exhausted. They are staying at home. Children are crying and feeling sick because of the heat. So it's really tough on the everyday life level, even with the exclusions of the constant attacks and air raid sirens. And this is Putin's hope that closer to the end of the year, beginning of the next year, people will be agreeing to anything just to stop this. The situation is that even if the war magically stops, our energy system would not be rebuilt. So we are facing really dark times for our country, and we understand that. I think it is very important again to look at another number that is telling us, well, okay, to what extent people are exhausted. And still the majority, the 83%, are saying not on Putin's terms. So this shows us this mix of people being exhausted, but still ready to continue the fight. And we need to take it seriously and to show it again to our allies, saying, well, look, this is a situation. In 2.5 years, we were unable to protect our energy systems with the amount of air defense systems that we were provided. And right now, the majority of it is destroyed. It is impossible to rebuild the energy system and the grid and the plants in like 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. That's also the truth. So it will be a really tough situation for us, for all of us. So do you have any plan about that? Because our plan did not change. And this plan is to continue fighting. For people who have seen what is happening in the temporary occupied territories and the deoccupied territories, I think it's very clear what will happen to all of us if Russians would come. So our goal will still be to fight. The question would be how long we can do that. And I think we do not have a good answer to that, but we need to continue to our work on persuading all our allies in getting us enough of the weapons and the supplies. You know, it's like a never-ending story that is going through your brain, especially when you are talking to our military or you are talking to the people on the street. They are asking you very simple questions, like, do we need more proofs that Russia is evil? Or what's stopping our allies in getting us the weapons that we can fight? Like, what's going on? How many more people need to die so it will be very clear what's right and wrong and the decisions can be made? And these questions, there is not a good answer to them, right? So as a Ukrainian politician, I can tell you, I only see the way out and is to continue our work on the international arena and persuading whoever we can persuade that what is happening has a direct influence on people's lives in the countries where they live. Not only with just the direct influence, but also how it will have the influence on the migration, on the world order, on the trade, on America being the greatest democracy in the world, all the other things. But it's a tough job, and it's also, I'm very afraid that when we do it right, it will be too late.
I mean, all of this is extremely powerful, and thank you for being so frank in sharing these concerns. I don't want to steer this in an even darker direction, but there is one variable in this entire calculus on which I think a lot hinges, and that's the domestic politics in the United States. It was very difficult to get the most recent supplemental bill across the finish line. Whoever is elected in November, I think it's going to be more difficult still when the next iteration of the same bill becomes needed, which will be sooner rather than later. This is a matter of months. Really, it's not that much money, it's not that much equipment. And there is one presidential candidate who promises to fix the situation, end the war even before he takes office. And arguably, his doing that would require forcing Ukraine into a very bad and short-lived peace, giving up territory in exchange for Russians stopping the fire for a bit. What will Ukrainians do if the United States and Russia try to force some sort of harebrained peace deal on them? Will they continue fighting? Will they take the break to sort of rebuild their military? Are people sort of thinking about external events really sort of shaping Ukraine in a way that almost feels too horrifying to imagine, but might very well become reality in a few months' time?
So, first of all, again, I need to say as a Ukrainian politician that we appreciate both parties' support to our country. And we know that in American domestic politics, no matter what we have to say about that, right? It's your domestic politics. And I think during the recent days, we have felt the importance of democracy even more, that it should be decided with a ballot and not with the gun. And we hope so much that at some point, we all will also be able to do it once again, right? Deciding it with a ballot. So I think the general threat in the modern world is offering simple solutions to complicated problems. Because if you can get a chance to ask more additional questions, then you would ask, well, how would you do that, right? How would you stop the war? I can tell you that as of right now, we perhaps have a couple of millions of Ukrainians who are armed. We have largest army in the whole Europe and potentially one of the strongest armies in the whole world. And this army is very much motivated. And in Ukraine right now, there was a recent poll also that was showing that 80% of the families have either someone fighting at the front or lost someone at the front, or they have someone that they know like very closely whom they have lost. So the blood price have already been paid. And then there is a question on like, well, so how do you do that? You go ahead and say, well, you stop fighting? Or you say, well, we have agreed on something, so now you have to stop it? This is the first question. And honestly, I don't know how it would work. I don't think it would work very well, especially again that the situation is very heated. It will allow Russian propaganda to say exactly what they're saying right now. We told you so. They would leave you alone. They don't treat you as equals and they will leave you out to dry. And I think they will use this opportunity. There is another question. Again, okay, so why would one or the other candidate think that Putin will keep his part of the bargain? We already have seen, and I'm not talking about my hatred to Putin. We are talking about the facts. The first fact is the Minsk agreements that was stricken as a deal, and the fighting from Russian side never stopped. And all the international community have seen that and said, yeah, well, maybe it was not them, etc., etc. There is another point, is the grain deal. Right? There was an agreement between Ukraine, Turkey, and United Nations, Russia, Turkey, and United Nations, and it was just recently. What did happen? Just at some point, Russia pulled out of the deal. They said, oh, yeah, well, you are not sending them the grain where you were supposed to, and this is why we are pulling away. And that's that. Well, thank God that our military were strong enough in the Black Sea that the grain deal continues without Russia being in it. And again, it did not happen because there was a brilliant negotiator. It happened because we were very strong and we had marine drones that were able to push Russian warships really away from the export paths. So even this example is telling you that it's a very naive and very weak position to say, well, we will strike a deal. And again, I think the one who strikes a deal with Russia will open up really a huge Pandora's box for all the other authoritarian regimes that will then say, well, this is now our time to attack.
Kira Rudik, the leader of the Holos Party, member of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada, thank you so much for this very sobering and frank conversation.
Thank you so much, and glory to Ukraine.
From me, Dalibor Rohac, from my friends Julia Zhouza and Giselle Donnelly, thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag Eastern Front Pod, written as one word, and you can also sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter using the link included in the show notes, and you'll receive more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you, and goodbye.